Welcome back to the Gardening with Joy and Holly radio show. Happy you've chosen us to be part of your day. Holly, let's go to the hotline and bring in our guest for this week.
Lee Miller is a landscape garden designer, consultant, garden coach, speaker, and award-winning garden blog author from the South Shore of Long Island, who has been involved in the horticulture industry for over 26 years. She is also the author of 5 publications. Welcome to the program, Lee.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Well, happy that you've taken time out of your day not only to educate Holly and myself, but all of our listeners. And I'll start with this. You grew up gardening. How did you get into landscaping? What was the transition? Where was that moment of, I like doing this, but the landscaping is even more fun?
Well, it's an interesting story. I feel my getting into landscape design is part life's path and part in my genes, and there's a story to tell. When I was growing up, I lived next to a neighbor that had 5 children all around the same age, and every day I would go across the street and go to her garden, Mrs. O, I call her, and she would show me her garden and take me along and identify all the plants and explain to me what they do and everything. So I took an interest. I went home and I said to my mom, I need to have some seeds and some pots. So she went and she got me some seeds, and I grew them and I nurtured them like they were my own child. And then at the age of 7, I planted my first tree with my dad. So as time went on, I went on to education. I always had an interest in science, but I took the education path. And the thing is about the genes, my mom always had an eye for being able to look at a blank space, and she could picture a vision in her mind, which is the same thing that I can do. Her brother, my uncle, was a landscape architect, and I found out that my great-grandfather was a prize-winning rosarian at Beechwood Mansion in Rhode Island back in the 1800s. So as I got older, the gardening, the path in life, I want to call it, and the genetics, it just grew. No pun intended. It just grew inside me, and I got more and more involved in gardening, and I went and I continued. While I was teaching, I went further with my education. I took some horticultural classes, and as time went on, I started designing my own landscape, and it grew, and it grew, and it grew. And friends and family, they saw some kind of potential in me, and they said, there's something going on here. You have an eye for gardens. Come over to my house. I'll give you dinner and design my garden. Mm-hmm. So I did. And with their encouragement, pushing me and motivating me to design for others, once again, I continued. I took more courses. I got a business license, and here I am today. So you would say partially a life's path and partially genetics.
So if it wasn't for your friends kind of pushing you, do you believe you would have made the leap on your own, or was that the motivation you needed?
That was the motivation, because I was unsure of myself going into business. It was a big step. And I have a couple of friends to thank for that. I say, you're the ones that got me into this. And I absolutely love what I do, and I thank them for that, for pushing me to go ahead and do it.
That's fantastic. So what tips do you have for someone who, maybe like Joy and I, who grow vegetables and flowers, but want to possibly hire a landscape designer, but then also do some ourselves? What are some tips for somebody like that, where we're kind of DIY, but also might need professional help?
Sure. Well, my best advice would be do your homework. Know the plants, know the lighting and moisture requirements for the plants you're choosing, and also their mature size. As a designer, I run into all the time somebody telling me, I bought this little dwarf bush, and now it's overtaking my house. So you really have to do your research, because a lot of dwarf evergreens, they claim that they're dwarf, but all it means that it's a smaller cultivar of the parent plant. So I would say that do your homework. A couple of tips when I'm designing, I always give enough space for the plants. So know the mature size of the plants, because way too often you see things all crowded in. Start with a backdrop of evergreens for all-season interest. I'm going to say use curvy linear beds. It's always nice to have smooth curves, have focal points on each end of the bed, have a flowering tree or an evergreen, and then mix in layers of flowering shrubs and then maybe perennials in front of that. It's all about continuing a theme. Repeat the same plants throughout the garden. Group in odd numbers. That's one of the main principles in design. It's more natural looking. It gives more of a flow to the garden, and have those layers. Create a layers so you have. My big thing is interest every single month of the year, and yes, you can have interest 12 months of the year. Another important point, which I tell clients all the time. You go to a store and you buy something, and lots of times people will ask, can I put such and such in my garden? And I'll say to them, that's not the right zone, because they might even be selling it. Always choose plants that are hardy to at least 1 to 2 zones colder than yours. Just in case, we've known the last couple of winters, we have gotten temperatures down in the single digits for extended periods of time. And that's going to be happening a lot more often. So best to go a couple zones lower.
Well, and in the vegetable world, we see that, there's space between the two plants. I want to put something else. But again, you've got to picture that final in August or September, what that tomato plant looks like, because you can't just shove another pepper plant in between. You got to have that spacing to allow for that growth. And the same with the trees and the shrubs and the flowers that you're speaking about.
Yes, exactly. And there's so many people that just cram it all together, and then the next thing they're doing is pulling it out, or the plant's not going to survive because they're going to compete with one another, especially with your vegetables.
And I don't blame them. It's just something that they're not swimming in it like we are daily, so they're not thinking, they've never done it before, so how would they know?
Right. Well, it's a matter of, once again, doing the homework.
Right.
When you buy the plants, if it says that it's going to mature to 2 to 4 feet round, give it that space.
And we would recommend...
You might have some mulch in between. That's okay. If you want a tighter look, if you're doing a privacy screening, sure, space them closer together, but always allow sufficient spacing.
And consult with a landscaper like you, and we encourage people to go to their local independent garden center where they have people who know what they're talking about. Correct.
And you can do it, and there's a lot of people that like to do it themselves, and that's great. That is terrific. There's so much satisfaction to it. Just tread lightly.
Right.
Do it carefully. And then when they lay out the beds, also is another tip. Take a hose or spray paint or flags and lay your bed out. Lay all your plants out before you plant. That way you can see how much space there is in between.
Those are some great tips. So your most recent book, Shade Gardening for the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, A Guide to Planting the Ultimate Shade Garden. Tell us more about your book. If our listeners pick up a copy, what can they expect, and just maybe something to pique their interest?
Oh, okay. The thing that motivated me to write this book is that very often I get requests from clients ask me saying, what can I plant in shade? They're so frustrated and they can't get anything to live, and the simple reason is they're not planting the right plant in the right place. So what I decided to do, I started searching around the internet for shade gardening books. And what I noticed was that every one that I came across, they listed the plants in alphabetical order. And I'm thinking, okay, I was also an educator for 32 years. So as an educator, I looked at it and said, okay, listing them in alphabetical order, that's not really helping me. That's not telling me right off which ones are evergreens, which ones are flowering, which ones are perennials. So I decided to put something together that would be a little bit more comprehensive, along with also explaining as our gardens mature, you're more likely to get more and more shade over time as trees grow. It's going to make more of a canopy. So what I had done was I went through all the different plants I've been using for the last 30-something odd years on my designs, and I organized it into a friendly reference that would go according to plant type, as I had mentioned. And it just made it so much more comprehensive. And then I would also say what the plant requires, how to take care of the plant. I did a section on diseases because that's big. When you're planting something, you need to know if there's a certain disease that it's prone to, how to treat it, and pretty much it's all about being proactive. If you have all that information in a reference, you could take that reference and say, okay, these are my evergreens, these are my flowering shrubs, these are my perennials, this is how I plant it, this is how I take care of it, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all about making a comprehensive, easy to follow reference for folks to plant their shade garden.
Well, speaking of shade, approximately how much shade is enough shade for, quote-unquote, a shade plant or a shade garden?
That's a very good question. Shade is defined in different ways. Generally, if an area is considered partial shade, it's receiving about 2 to 4 hours of sun during the day, preferably in the morning, and then some later afternoon sun, while full shade refers to an area receiving less than 2 hours of sunlight. Areas where I've done plenty of gardens like this, where someone has a lot of trees in the backyard, and it's kind of a dapple shade throughout the entire day. You have a little bit of sunlight, you have a little bit of shade. That is the perfect scenario for planting a lovely shade garden.
Well, that's very, very helpful to know. So speaking of more shade, what are some of your most, foolproof shade garden plants, especially perennials, and what are ones that newbies should possibly avoid?
There's so many. Some of the easiest ones, I would say, everybody knows hostas. Some people love hostas, some people hate hostas. And if you have deer, don't plant them. But hostas are very easy to take care of. Ferns, the Japanese forest grass, Halconia grass, is very nice. Variegated liriope. There's different types of liriope that's variegated in this green. I love the variegated. It's kind of a yellow and green grass-like leaf, and it gets little purple flowers later in the summer into the fall, and it's very low maintenance. All you have to do is cut it back in spring, not in fall, because that could jeopardize the crown of the plant, but you cut it back in springtime, and it flushes back all new growth. Astilbe is lovely. Coral bells. Euchera. There are so many varieties of coral bells. My favorites are Palace Purple, which is a deep burgundy color, and Caramel, which is just that caramel colored. You mix the two of those together, put it along with some liriope, which is the variegated grass, or sedge, golden sedge, and you have the burgundy, you've got the caramel, and you've got the gold, and it's magnificent. It's a perfect mix. As far as shrubs, skip laurel, excellent for privacy, take shade. Cherry laurel is a lower form, both broadleaf evergreens, dark green leaves, and little white flowers in spring. Boxwood, there's variegated, there's the regular green boxwood, there's an upright, there's all different types of boxwood. Akuba, underused in my opinion. Akuba is broadleaf evergreen, green with yellow spots, and it thrives in shade. Osmanthus, or false holly, is another beautiful shrub. I use it all the time in shade. Variegated foliage. The new growth gets little pink tips on it. There's different types. I use, for the listeners, Goshiki is your best one. It's the nicest coloration, and it's also the slowest growing and only grows, I want to say between 4 and 6 feet, but it's rarely see it get that big. You can easily prune it. Lucosi. is a nice broadleaf evergreen. Hydrangea, of course. I find that oak leaf hydrangeas seem to perform the best in shade out of the different ones. And of course, you have rhododendrons and azaleas, which brings us to, I believe you asked which ones to avoid or could cause problems.
Correct.
Well, the skip laurel and cherry laurel, I use them all the time. And I encourage any gardener to use them. The only thing is you have to know, because they're broadleaf evergreens, and with our changing crazy weather conditions, with the wet springs and whatnot, they are prone to something called shot hole fungus. It looks like bullet holes in the leaves. If you see the round circles in the leaves, if you know what it is, you simply spray it with a fungicide. So they're beautiful plants, but yes, a little more work. I'm also going to have to mention rhododendrons, unfortunately. Rhododendrons are absolutely beautiful for shade. I have been finding over the last 3 years, as a matter of fact, that the established rhododendrons are still doing very well. But for some reason, the newly planted rhododendrons, it's the shock freezes in the wintertime. They're taking them out. So you kind of have to be careful with that, as far as that. But once again, the moral of the story is, if you know the plant, what it's susceptible to, and you know how to treat it, it's as simple as spraying the plant to control it. Yeah.
Right. Well, Lee, we greatly appreciate the time you've offered Holly, myself, and all of our listeners, and the education. How can people find out more about you and pick up your book?
Well, you can simply search Lee Miller Gardening on the net, and my website, Landscape Design by Lee, will show up. That's my business site. My blogs, I have 2 blogs, A Guide to Northeastern Gardening and A Guide to Landscape Design and Maintenance will pop up, and also my 5 books will pop up. And to find the books, you can also go on, they're available on Amazon. Simply search Lee Miller Gardening, and you'll find me.
Well, Lee, thank you so much for the information and the education you provided Holly and myself. We thank you very much for the time you've offered.
Well, thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely.